Hello, and a very warm welcome to this afternoon's event on the politics of measuring gender equality in education. I'm Esme Kadzamira, Research Fellow at the University of Malawi, and your chair this afternoon. I'm speaking from Malawi, where girls' education has been a government priority for the past 30 years. This has resulted in significant improvements in the enrollment of girls at all levels of education, more particularly at primary level. At this level, girls now constitute half the enrollments, a significant improvement from the situation in the early 1990s when girls' enrollment were below 40% of the primary enrollments. However, despite these impressive enrollment gains, challenges still remain. Girls from poor households are least likely to complete primary and transition to secondary school. And gender gaps in enrollment favoring boys remain at secondary and higher education levels. A major focus of my work as a research fellow has been on the interplay between gender and access, educational and learning outcomes. I want to extend a particularly warm welcome to Elaine, Nicole, Yanchun, and Sharon. Thank you for spending time with us this afternoon. We really appreciate the opportunity to hear and learn from you. In terms of how we run this event, I'll briefly introduce our speakers and then we'll kick off with the presentations. We are also here to respond to your questions, so please send us your questions and comments using the Q&A facility on Slido. You can also tweet about the event with the hashtag AGEE event. As usual, this event is being recorded and will be posted online. At this juncture, allow me to introduce our speakers. We have Irene Antahata, the principal investigator of the AGEE project and professor of education and international development at UCL. Nicole Bella, senior education specialist at the UNESCO Global Education Monitoring Report. Yanchun Zhang, chief of statistics at the Human Development Office, UNDP. And Sharon Tao, director of education, Girls Education Challenge. I'll now invite Elaine to give her presentations. Elaine, thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Esme, and very warm greetings to everyone joining from different time zones. It's great to have your interest and support in this presentation of the work from the AGEE project. In the presentation I'm going to make, I'm going to draw on the work of the whole AGEE team, who have brought a wonderful array of insights and skills into our collaboration, and I'm enormously grateful to work with this wonderful team. The context of this talk is that gender inequality remains a problem all over the world. Gender inequalities intersect with race, class, ethnic, and other inequalities. Education, which is widely seen, and I believe correctly, as a way to address and change these inequalities, can also, without constant scrutiny and evaluation, become a setting to reinscribe or recast inequalities. There is discrimination entailed in keeping girls and boys out of school, not doing enough to support their progress and attainment, and failing to use learning and teaching to think well together about changing inequalities. Gender is personal, political, cultural, social, historically changing, and always under discussion. It's a really challenging area to be working in. And equalities and social justice are also very, have their many contours, many difficulties in realizing them. Programs for girls' education and gender equality often lose momentum around wider social transformations. Approaches to evaluation, data, and measurement frequently are technical exercises, not engaged with much public debate around evidence and how or why or by whom it is used. So in this talk, I want to, about the politics of gender equality in education and measurement, I want to draw out three themes. Firstly, I want to discuss how we think about gender equality and education and the associated measures used. Secondly, I want to present to you how we in the AGEE project have sought to address some of the limitations in the thinking about this that we've identified. And thirdly, I want to outline what some of the politics, policies, and practices of measurement are, which we need to think about at global, national, and local levels, given the profound traumas and disruptions of the contemporary moment. It's partly linked with the pandemic. It's partly linked with some appalling conflicts that persist in the world. And we need to think about this in the light of the way that girls' education has been centrally positioned by the G7 Girls' Education Declaration. Gender equalities in education. Let's start with thinking about gender equalities in education. The issue is, do we see this as a problem with some complexities, such as, for example, how we define gender or which phase or modality of education we want to focus on? Is it a kind of complicated problem for which there's a simple solution, such as get girls into school, ensure they are learning, or that they pass examinations? This approach is a bit like a vaccination, which is why the photo's been chosen. This has been the mainstream fix attempted for many problems associated with development. Education, particularly for girls, is seen as a single vaccination dose that will protect against all our social ills, be they population growth, economic stagnation, or pandemics. Let's set against this a different way of framing the problem that sees gender inequalities as so complex, so interrelated, with difficult relationships around poverty, violence, geopolitics, homophobia, personal identity, and the complex instabilities around education, that we can do nothing more than document little pieces of the picture, but never change it. These two approaches to talk about gender inequalities in education talk past each other, each not quite getting what the other is aiming for. And we think that there's a need for some bridge buildings. So in that process, though, the two different ways of thinking about gender inequality in education I've sketched out also map onto two different positions of how to define the problem of how to measure and evaluate solutions. The one position I have termed what works, because this has been the focus of a mainstream approach in evaluation. Once we have a set of policies and practices that are considered to work, they are widely promoted and we measure their rollout. This approach contrasts with one I have termed what matters. This is the position of many critics of what works, who highlight that what matters is, for example, gender equality, human rights, solidarity, care, or well-being. These values, the critics argue, should frame our analysis. So my position on this has long been to stand in the middle. If something matters, and human rights, gender equality, and social environmental justice matter to me a lot, I really do want what matters to work. Equally, I think that if something works, it's important to know why and how it works and what the implications are for what matters. So in the AGEE project, we've looked at this problem of politics, evaluation, and measurement, highlighting how two communities, one largely associated with practice and one with the academy, tend to talk past each other. In trying to get beyond that kind of miscommunication, we've developed a new approach through our partnership involving 4 universities. And you can see the icons for the university on the slide: UCL, University of KwaZulu-Natal, University of Malawi, and UEA. Our work has been supported by grants from ESRC and FCDO, and the project has worked in dialogue with a number of UN agencies, NGOs, and civil society organizations. Okay, so in the work on the AGEE project, what we've addressed is that the standard way of measuring gender issues in education has to be to focus on gender parity. Gender parity entails counting girls as a proportion of boys in enrollment, attendance, attainment, noting women teachers as a proportion of men teachers. So the photo on the left is a kind of vision of gender parity. Gender parity is a good, clear indicator, but it, like information on girls participating in particular education projects, does not tell us enough about what matters. Gender parity, as used in data collections for education management information systems, tells us nothing, for example, about the sexual division of labor in a household, which may account for why a girl drops out of school, or school-related gender-based violence, which may be a feature of how she does in examinations. Gender parity does not indicate whether gender equality policy exists in education or other areas that link with education, and how policy is implemented. It gives no information on whether taxes are spent with the needs of the poorest in mind, taking account of gender. But trying to measure what matters can be a huge headache. There are so many sources of information looking at so many different levels that it's hard to know where to start or what approach to take. In the AGEE framework, we've been very fortunate in that we have had many critical friends in the world of policy and practice. We have spoken who have helped us in this task of where to start. We have spoken through our fieldwork in Malawi and South Africa with people working in government and civil society. Internationally, we have worked with UNGAI, UNESCO, and the GAD network. Colleagues at IOE have been working on issues of gender and education and researching it for approximately 30 years, partnering with colleagues in many countries. We've drawn on concepts from the capability approach and experiences those, for example, in UNDP and Sdgs, who have used this to develop a conceptually well-organized framework to shape multiple data sources needed to evaluate aspects of gender equality. And we've used this experience of working with many different people to develop the framework. So this is our AGEE framework. In this infographic, you can see the 6 fields, each of which organizes indicator information and allows us to look at relationships that matter, providing information to evaluate progress towards gender equality in education and addressing girls' needs, rights, and capabilities using a range of measures. The framework is intended to be useful at global, national, and local levels. Conceptually, it draws on the ways the capability approach highlights how opportunities, freedoms, and agency need to be considered alongside outcomes, resources, and measures of subjective well-being. So I'll just talk a little bit through some of the detail of the 6 domains in the AGEE framework. So firstly, resources. These are the goods and services required for a gender equitable education system. They comprise money, policy, schools, trained teachers, administrators, support workers, learning materials, and information. The second field is values. These are an important part of the context regarding how policy is understood, put into practice, or contested. Values are expressed in formal policy frameworks or laws like a constitution, and in more informal discourses, which describe what people consider right or good. Values include ideas about, for example, rights, capabilities, Ubuntu, national unification, peace, human development, or human capital, or attention to girls' voices. Thirdly, there is a field for opportunities. These are features of historical and contemporary relationships around education that shape whether there are different gender differences in how differently located individuals and institutions can convert resources into actual opportunities. These relationships, which are sometimes referred to as context, work at global, national, and local levels and can support or limit gender equality in education. These relationships may form girls' realization of rights, or they may give some limited rights in education and take away rights in another area, for example, economic justice. I've referred to this approach as dispersal. Fourthly, there is participation in education. This is the area most frequently monitored by governments in education sector planning. This field looks at gender differences in the capability to participate in education and levels of participation and progress of girls and boys in all levels of education, looking at socioeconomic status, location, race, ethnicity. Fifthly, there are outcomes of education, which comprise knowledge, skills, and understanding in relation to formal instruction, such as reading or arithmetic or science, and informal formation of attitudes such as tolerance, peace, gender equality, or sustainability. And sixthly, there is a field for outcomes, which look at support for girls and women and gender equality beyond the education system. For example, in health, employment, access to social protection, prevention of violence, political participation, the ability to exercise rights, and many other areas of human development. So I've given you the detail of the AGEE framework, the rationale for why and how it was developed, and I really look forward to your critical comments. In closing, I want to return to some political issues. The G7 foreign ministers meeting in London at the beginning of May agreed 2 goals for low and lower middle income countries to be reached by 2026. To get 40 million more girls in school and 20 million more girls reading by the end of primary school. The declaration notes, and I quote, "We want to empower girls to lead change, including in peace building and in efforts to tackle the climate crisis." There are commitments on gender responsive teaching, catch-up classes, and some $15 billion has been pledged. This is nowhere near enough. As commentators estimate, the annual funding gap for global education is nearly $200 billion. And the UK cuts to the aid budget have been made, and cuts to the UK aid budget have made, which will have consequences for work on girls' education. But it's a beginning, and we have to start there. The G7 commitment is linked to the SDGs, where there is a broader agenda signed by virtually all the governments in the world with more targets around gender equality and women's empowerment. It's also linked with the Generation Equality Forum convened by UN Women with 6 action coalitions. We're not short of policy frameworks, nor vision statements at global and national level. Through the pandemic, ideas have been circulated about the need to build back better or build back equal. And one idea I've been discussing could be termed build back careful, because it tries to take account of the complexities of the political economy of care, which is often gendered, local, and overlooked. But if we are going to make visions work through policy and practice in ways that matter, we need a clear action and evaluation plan to make education systems effectively address gender and intersecting inequalities. We need to steer our work towards equality, understanding that gender relations in real world settings shape what we wish for and what we do. This is not a task for the education sector alone or just for governments in alliance with education NGOs. This is a task for joining up social policy, linking education with health, social protection, work, politics, and culture. It needs respectful engagement with those who suffer most and who are so rarely listened to. It also needs academic and activist scrutiny and critique. We can only measure better together. Thanks very much for listening. In AGEE, we look forward to hearing your comments and engaging with you. Our website with lots of information about the framework is going live today, and we have just received a further year of funding for this work. We hope with your participation we can go further and do more to put the AGEE framework into use for measuring gender equality in education, constantly reviewing the politics, policies, and practice we need to steer towards relationships that can change the injustices of the present. Thanks.
Oh, thank you very much, Elaine, for that brilliant presentation. At this juncture, I want to invite Nicole Bera to give her response to Elaine's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Esme. And thank you very much, Elaine. And I think before I start, I really want to thank Elaine for this breakthrough work and innovative work that really help us, increase our understanding of gender equality in education and to monitor it for better and more effective accountability. Better education is a fundamental human right that we all must enjoy. Yet for decades, girls have been deprived and are still deprived of this basic right, and their access to education was much lower and is still so than that of girls of boys in many countries around the world. And this despite international binding and non-binding treaties, instruments against discrimination, and more specifically against gender discrimination in education. For decades, international and national efforts have been to improve girls and women access to education. And this has worked. For example, there are more girls in and completing school than ever before, and gender parity in enrollment is now achieved in more countries than 25 years ago. But does this mean that gender equality has also been achieved? No, I'm afraid. Gender equality is more than equal numbers of girls and boys and women and men, and it remains a distant goal. It won't be achieved if relevant laws and policies are not in place. Advancing gender equality requires to change our mindset and to move the spotlight from gender parity that does not give us the whole picture, as Elaine said before, to pay due attention to substantive gender equality. In other words, to cultural, social, institutional, and legal barriers that still hold back gender equality achievement. While keep working to ensure that girls have access to schools on equal foots as boys, there is a need to ensure their rights are protected within education itself, and then benefit of equal learning opportunities as boys, free from gender bias and stereotypes. Conceived and developed in 2015 by Elaine, the framework we are present today help us increase understanding of the substantive reason behind persisting gender inequality in education. It is a great opportunity to interrogate the way we have been dealing with gender equality so far. In doing so, it helps improve its monitoring to to better and more effectively hold education actors and stakeholders to account for their commitment, including financial commitment made by G7 countries. The framework proposed a broader visions of gender equality that address the different issues related to girls and women education, while recognizing the need to protect the right to education of boys and men as well, as people with different sexual orientation and different gender identity. The gender equality framework main objective is to improve the availability and accessibility of quantitative and qualitative data on gender equality. It helps identify gender issues to address, indicators to monitor those issues across the different domain of the framework while examining existing laws and policies outside and inside education to address gender inequalities. Then the framework makes it possible to monitor country actual commitments to overcome discrimination and barriers to gender equality outside and inside education systems. It is a key instrument to help countries to improve their education sector plans, make them more gender responsive, and build their national capacity accordingly. I would like to stress that in line with the core SDG agenda principle of leaving no one behind, there is a need to pay more attention to intersecting inequalities to make gender equality in education more inclusive for a greater social justice. And this framework helps having such an intersectional approach. Using a three-pronged right-based approach to gender equality, that is right to, right in, and right through education, the Gender Equality Monitoring Framework proposed 6 domains that help frame the discussion of gender equality to, in, and through education. The slide you have there here and the diagram show you the way we have ourselves trying to conceptualize the breakthrough work that Elaine has initiated. So the framework that you have in front of you has 6 domains, including the first domain, educational opportunities, meaning mainly in terms of equal number for boys and girls and men and women in education, in other words, gender parity. Then we have gender norms, values, and attitudes. Why is so important to reflect this in the framework is because really gender norms and value, discriminatory gender norms really frame everything, including laws and policies. That's why it's so important to now, as I said before, change our mindset to really focus on what really matters, what is really needed to advance gender equality. And the framework also includes a domain in what we call institution outside education. Why is it so important? Because gender equality in education will not happen if outside education there's no a firm commitment to make it happen. That's why it's so important to keep the link between what is going on outside and what is going on inside education. So it's also important now to pay really attention to laws and policy, education laws and policy themselves within education system that guarantees the right to education for boys and girls and for men and women and for what now we call SOGI population, meaning people with different sexual orientation and different gender identity. It's also important to look at, as I said, what is really going on inside education itself in terms of resources, the distribution between distribution both in terms of finance and teachers, teaching and learning practice and learning environment. And finally, as Elaine said, it's also important now to see what what's next. You know, if gender equality is to be achieved in education, that will not necessarily mean that it will be achieved in society at large, because as I said, it's really important to have a holistic approach to these issues, because everything is everything are linked, and education is a reflection of what is going on at the society as a whole. So how are we using this gender equality framework? We at the GEM report have been using this framework, particularly in its gender report. Of the many indicators that we have identified in the broad frameworks, we are using 30 select indicators, both in the gender report itself and the discussion that is taking place in this report, but also these indicators are published at the back of this report. Secondly, monitoring progress towards gender equality also means not only to have quantitative data, but also to have a sense of changes in national laws and policies, which the GEM report is also now doing. To this effect, we are developing country profiles on legal and political framework to advance gender equality in education. The objective of this activity is to collect information on existing laws and policies or lack of to advance gender equality in order to monitor the extent to which countries are translating on the ground recommend laws and policies by both CEDAW, Article 7 and General Recommendation 36, and the Education 2030 Framework of Action. So compilation of information on existing laws and policies is based on the template of questions reflecting these recommend policies across 6 sections, including countries' commitment to gender equality more broadly, education laws, plans, policy, and programs, education systems in terms of school-related gender-based violence, teacher training, and women presence in education workforce, gender-responsive budgeting and finance, meaning gender-responsive budgeting, but also equitable funding mechanisms. And of course, the issue of gender norms, values, and practice, because it's so important to challenge discriminatory gender norms if gender equality is to happen. And finally, it's really important to have in place mechanism to monitor gender equality in education. And the AGEE project, it's one way of doing so, and it's so important. That's why it's so important, this work. The development of country profile is a long-term exercise with building blocks added each year based on focus areas in the gender report and its gender report. The work was launched in 2020, focusing on select strategic objectives and actions of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, which 25th anniversary was celebrated last year and covered in the 2020 gender report. So this building block that we used last year includes the issue pertaining to early pregnancy and education, school counseling for higher education, teaching and learning materials, women in the education workforce, and school-related gender-based violence. The work has started with 40 countries across the different world and around the regions, including those where gender gaps are highest, but it aims to be more global in coverage. Thank you for listening, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Nicole, for the deep reflections on the gender equality framework that has been used in the GEM report. And at this juncture, allow me to invite Yan Chung to give her response. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Esme. Let me share my screen. Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to join the distinguished panel this morning, for you this afternoon. For those of you who may not know our office, Human Development Report Office, we are a small research office, independent research office located at UNDP, United Nations Development Program. Our mission is to advance human development through research, data analysis, outreach, and advocacy. The human development approach is the people-centered approach. So in our view, progress in human development is linked to expanding freedoms, capabilities, and functionings of individuals. So today, my presentation will focus on the gender indices and dashboards we produce at the Human Development Report Office. As Ilian mentioned earlier, education should not be looked at alone. It should be linked to other aspects of development. So I'm going to talk about the current gender indices we are produced in the office, but also some new dashboards we rolled out recently. Then last, I'm going to introduce a new new generation of gender indices we are going to launch in 2 months' time. So give you a bit of history. Our office started publishing the Human Development Report back in 1990. So last year we celebrated the 30-year anniversary. So we publish a global Human Development Report every year. We also publish the key measure of well-being, the Human Development Index. So the Human Development Index was developed to challenge the idea that a nation's progress could be assessed by its economic growth, GDP, usually measured by GDP. But the Human Development Index we publish in the office is to provide a simple measure of human progress built around people's freedom to live the lives they want to. The Human Development Index has gained popularity with its simple but comprehensive formula that assess a population's average longevity, education, and income. So after 30 years, this index still remains a very popular development index. Over the years, there has been growing interest in providing a more comprehensive set of measurements that capture both other critical dimensions of human development. So our office responded to this cause with new measures of aspects of human development to complement the HDI, Human Development Index, we have been producing in 1990. These missing dimensions include poverty, inequality. It also includes gender gaps and also include other dimensions of poverty. So since 2010, we have been publishing an inequality adjusted HDI, which adjusts a nation's Human Development Index value for inequality within each of the components. Then joined with OFI, we also published a multidimensional poverty index to capture deprivations more directly. Similarly, our efforts to measure gender inequalities began in the 1995. Then currently we produce 2 important gender indices in our annual report. One is Gender Inequality Index, GRI. The other is a Gender Development Index, GDI. So let me give you a little bit of a timeline. So the gender issue was reflected in our very first report in 1990, but we started publishing some gender-related measurement index in 1995. So we have published this old gender-related development index and gender empowerment measures from 1995 to 2009. Then we reformed these indices, and in 2010, we rolled out this new Gender Inequality Index. Then 4 years later, we complement GRI with this new Gender Development Index. So other indices, statistical tables, and the statistic dashboards have also been added to provide a more comprehensive perspectives of the relative data to assess countries' human development, including the gender aspects. For example, in the current reports, we included 2 gender-related dashboards. One is called Life Course Gender Gap dashboard. The other is a Women's Empowerment dashboard. Then last year, we introduced a new gender index called Gender Social Norms Index, which has been received a lot of positive feedback. Then because of this positive feedback, this year we're going to do an update on this Gender Social Norm Index. Then in July this year, we're going to roll out, as I said earlier, new generation of gender indices jointly with UN Women. So let me give you a little bit of details of some of these indices, because I think they will be nice complementaries to what Elaine and Nicole presented just now. So this slide just shows you the current gender indices and dashboards we have in office. So this slide and next slide give you a snapshot of what we construct in GDI and GRI. So GDI measures disparities in the Human Development Index by gender. So it's simply calculated as a ratio of female HDI versus male HDI. Then we use very simple formula. We look at 3 dimensions: long and healthy life, knowledge or education, and standard of living. Then we are looking at 4 indicators, gender disaggregated indicators. Then data sources are all from UN agencies or other international organizations. Then for the Gender Inequality Index, GRI, which is a very, very popular gender index, widely used by academia and policymakers, it measures gender inequalities in empowerment. The value of GRI ranges from 0, where women and men fare equally, to 1, where one gender fares as poorly as possible in all measured dimensions. But of course, you find most countries, all the countries fall in between these 2 extremes. Then again, we are looking at 3 dimensions: reproductive health, empowerment, and the labor market. This is a very popular index. But over time, we also have received a lot of comments, feedback, and criticism on GDI and GRI. So we have been constantly and continuously working on making these indices better. Then here, I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about the new gender social norm index we rolled out last year, because as Esme mentioned at the opening of today's event, over the past century, there have been remarkable progress made on gender equality in terms of basic rights, political, economic, and social rights. But on the other hand, the world is not on track to achieve gender equality by 2030. So our GRI, Gender Inequality Index, already shows overall progress in reducing gender inequality has been slowing in recent years. So why is progress towards some aspects of gender equality getting slower and more difficult? In our 2019 Human Development Report, we argue that the progress towards gender equality is confronting moving targets and inequality traps. What do we mean? We meant that disadvantaged groups, from data we have observed, disadvantaged groups catching up in terms of basic capabilities, but they lag behind in enhanced capabilities. But these enhanced capabilities are crucial for women and girls to empower themselves to reach the full potential. So for example, in about 50 countries, we have observed women have achieved more education than men, but we also observe they work longer hours, but earn 40% less income than their male counterparts. So that's why social norms are central to the understanding of these dynamics. Gender inequality has long been associated with persistent discriminatory social norms, prescribing social roles and power relations between men and women in society. So our Gender Social Norm Index look at 4 dimensions, then 7 indicators constructed based on responses from the World Values Survey. So it's a very simple index. It's not perfect, but we have used this index to stress the importance of combining different dimensions to assess biases against gender equality. So that's why this Gender Social Norm Index has received a lot of attention. So we believe going forward, we are going to continue the work on social norms, because the social norms are not directly observed, but their effects are influential in defining social outcomes. So we believe they should be monitored and presented and shared. Last year, because of COVID, we also constructed 2 new gender-related dashboards. One look at crisis and capabilities at risk. The other look at safe space, balanced care work, and agency. Because of the time constraint, I'm not going to go to the details of these 2 dashboards, but all what I present today are available on our website. Please feel free to check out. So these are the very rich source of information. We look at 4 dimensions, for example, in the dashboard for crisis and capabilities at risk. Then for the other dashboards, we look at 3 dimensions. We look at human development dimension, safe space and balanced care work, and agency dimension. Many of these dimensions indicators were also mentioned earlier in the Elaine's presentation and Nico's presentation. So I think we are reaching a consensus. What are the important indicators we need to monitor and use to measure the progress made on gender equality? I want to spend a little bit time talking about the new gender indices we're about to launch in July. As mentioned earlier, even though GDI and GRI have been featured in our report every year, they have received a lot of positive attention, but we're also aware of the issues and challenges faced by these 2 indices. In particular, for the popular GRI, Gender Equality Index, it has been criticized because it mixed absolute and relative indicators in the index, and also it mixes empowerment and well-being. So now in this new work with jointly with your woman, we try to construct it 2 separate indices, but these 2 separate indices work as a twin in the sense that they need to be examined together to get a full picture, to help you to get a full picture of where women's status stands. So here is a very, very simple framework we're trying to use to construct these 2 twin gender indices. One index will look at the relative status of women versus men in terms of achievements. Then the other index will focus on the agency aspect, focus on the empowerment aspect. So the second index will measure the absolute level of women's empowerment. So you can say one index is on relative well-being or achievements, the other index is on absolute empowerment. Then for the first index, we are looking at 4 dimensions in terms of life and good health, in terms of education, skills, and knowledge, in terms of labor and financial inclusion, and also in terms of participation in decision-making. For the absolute status of women's empowerment index, we are looking at the same 4 dimensions plus 1 dimension, freedom from violence. In the literature, then we are aware sometimes the freedom from violence is included in the life and good health dimension, but we think it is so important aspect of gender empowerment. We decided to to include it as a separate dimension in our construction of the Women's Empowerment Index. So I'm not going to go over all the indicators we used in the construction of these 2 indices, but I will give you a taste of what education indices we are looking at in both index construction. So for the education dimension, we look at 2 indicators. One is population with completed secondary education or higher. In the previous trials of reforming gender education indices, we have been looking at other educational indicators, but we feel as a society making progress, then the primary education or even secondary education indicators are not enough to capture the enhanced capabilities we need to monitor. So that's why in this joint project, we are looking at population with completed secondary education or higher. the data on tertiary education we have looked at as well, but the data is not very, doesn't have the good country coverage yet. So that's why we didn't go directly to the tertiary completion of the tertiary education. Then the other indicator we use in this dimension is youth aged 15 to 24 who are not in education, employment, or training. So this is the indicator we got from ILO. It is very important. This education is not only about schooling, it's also about training and other educational opportunities when you get out of school. So that's why we are looking at this indicator NEET. Maybe I will also mention, some value added. We think these two new indices will bring to the vast arena of gender indices. We believe our twin indices allow us to look at the relative gender gaps and absolute levels of empowerment separately, so which address some of the criticism we have received on our GRI. Then it also includes gender-based violence indicator. That's one of the innovation we believe our indices have embraced. So because of time constraint, I'm not going to the details of these two indices, but we are going to launch them in July. Then we strongly recommend you to pay attention to our launch event notification. Then we also welcome your feedback after they are introduced in the summer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yanchun, for your presentation, and you have let us go through the journey the Human Development Report Office has undertaken over the years in a strive to come up with a better measurement for gender equality. And I think this is in line with what AGEE is trying to do. Thank you very much. At this moment, let me invite Sharon to give her response to the presentation. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Esme, and thank you to all the presenters. And thank you for providing me the opportunity to give some reflections on the AGEE framework that Elaine presented. And some of these reflections are also applicable to Nicole's presentation on the GEM report and Yanchun's presentation on the UNDP's Gender Indices. Before I start, for those of you who may not be familiar with the Girls Education Challenge, it's a 12-year FCDO funded program aiming to improve educational opportunities for marginalized girls. Through 41 different projects across 17 different countries. I feel very privileged to be the education director and team leader of the GCFM. And I also feel very privileged to be here to discuss the framework, the AGEE framework, because it is extremely pertinent to the GEC, as it's something that the GEC is very well positioned to potentially contribute to, as well as benefit from on many levels. Conceptually, operationally, politically. So I think I wanted to frame my reflections today through those three prisms: conceptual, operational, and political. I should also note that Elaine shared a paper with me that provides a bit more of an elaboration on the AGEE framework than what was presented today, particularly with regard to its capability approach underpinnings. So I'll try not to get into too much detail, but I was really taken by that paper, and I'm not sure if it's in the public domain yet, but I would highly recommend it. So that said, from a conceptual perspective, I really applaud the aim to engage with the metrics and measurement discourse and agree with all of the critiques of using gender parity as a metric for gender equality and gender injustice in education. As everyone, many of us have noted today, capturing the ratios of females versus males with regards to things like enrollment or completion, it might be necessary, but certainly not sufficient. And so with the use of the capability approach to widen the conceptual framing and understanding of gender equality and gender injustice in education is music to my ears. And particularly as noted in the paper that Elaine shared with me, you know, metrics often only focus on achievements or functionings, such as literacy levels, enrollment, exam scores. And this doesn't necessarily take into account the personal and social and environmental constraints, particularly those related to gender, like chore burden, violence that was mentioned earlier. And these things can have a significant effect on girls' capabilities or opportunities to even begin to make progress on any of those achievements or functionings. So certainly widening the metrics and measurements to acknowledge capability constraint also widens and nuances any subsequent policy or intervention. Something that was I kind of noted because the GEC was mentioned in the paper was that, you know, there are a lot of individual level data sets that look at capabilities or opportunities for individual girls. And these are often compiled by smaller scale projects, much like those in the GEC, but there's a sort of disconnect between those data sets and any sort of institutional or system level processes or data sets. And that's entirely correct. And although some of the GEC projects work with and through governments, schools, and systems, they aren't set up to be system strengthening programs that work at scale. So a lot of the data sets are quite specific to projects themselves, which by nature is also the focus of these projects, to focus very specifically on specific girls, subgroups of marginalized girls. So this starts to speak to some of the reflections I was having regarding the operationalization of the AGEE framework, how to connect those more nuanced data around capabilities into more macro institutional processes, analyses, programming. I had the benefit in this paper of being able to look at some examples of the wide variety of indicators and sources of data that were proposed with the framework. And my first thought was, wow, what a very rich and helpful, you know, kind of breadth of information. But then my sort of practical side started nagging at me and asking, you know, who would be the person or group to be collecting and analyzing this vast amount of information and data with such a variety of sources. Gathering, analyzing is quite a task, particularly across many different countries and contexts. That's not a reason not to do it at all, but something that obviously has to be thought through. And then there are lots of other technical issues, which I'm sure have already been thought through, things like aggregating and weighting. Are there certain standards that need to be met for every indicator? Who and how is this determined? I'm sure you thought this through. And then there are those indicators that are located more at the micro level. There were things like teaching, practice, and training, levels of confidence and choice amongst girls. And, you know, and this is data that is very much collected by many GEC projects and could potentially contribute. And then again, my practical side, it raised the issues that these are relatively small samples, certainly relative to a country context and not necessarily representative samples. And then there's issues of comparability. You know, we have GEC projects that might be in the same country, but go about collecting data against similar things in very different ways with different levels of reliability and robustness. So again, this starts to speak to the ability to do cross-country comparisons given the different types and levels of data. And so therefore cross-country comparisons might only be indicative, but I could be wrong. You know, that was just the sort of reflection that I was taking away. And particularly for those countries that might not be doing well, they may challenge, you know, the ability to compare. But that being said, I really see, you know, saw the value of using this kind of rich and varied sort of sources of data to provide a more nuanced situational analysis to guide individual countries' education sector planning. And that would be incredibly valuable if it's not already being done. And so finally, this leads to my final reflection on the political. And in working on the GEC over the past year, I've come to reflect on the number and type of requests by donors like FCDO for all data analysis reporting to be very short, sharp, and high level. And this is not to say that there isn't an appreciation or complexity, appreciation for complexity or nuance, but there's often a lack of time or space for engagement. And I've also reflected that many political decision makers that don't necessarily have a background in gender or education, that also presents a demand for simplicity, be it of concept, of indicator, of target, of explanation, that can then be turned into a soundbite. So again, this is a reason not to push the political discourse surrounding girls' education to be more complex and nuanced, but it's definitely worth being aware of the constraints that shape the demand for these short, sharp, high-level reductive approaches, and how and to what degree the AGEE framework can and should interface with this. So this leads to my final reflection that despite some of the tensions that I've highlighted, I absolutely applaud the aim to take what by nature, a reductive indicator, and try to broaden it into a framework of indicators that reflect the nuance and complexity surrounding gender equality and gender injustice in education. I really applaud that. And it is a challenging task with many things to think through practically, but absolutely worth doing. And I hope I can speak on behalf of my GC colleagues by saying that we would be very happy to contribute in any way that we can. So thanks very much, and thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Sharon. And thank you for your reflections on the gender equality measurement and the AGEE framework as it relates to the work that you're doing at GCE. And this marks the end of our presentations. And at this time, this is mindful of the time that now it's 4 o'clock. We are supposed to have a Q&A with the audience.
Esme, I've got 2 questions which maybe I should try to respond to, and others might want to pick up. Shall I respond? Is that okay, Esme, to respond to the 2 questions? There's one question about the aid cuts, and one question about indicators, and that indicators themselves might be gender biased. Can I respond on those 2 questions?
Yes, I think you can. Go ahead, Elaine.
Thank you, Esme, and adding my thanks to Yanchun and Sharon and Nicole for lots of information about indicators, lots of ways that we can work together and complement each other's work, and you know, the kind of AGEE idea of building a community of practice around people, this kind of nerdy concern with indicators, but also the big picture stuff about trying to bring about change. I really appreciate your reflections. The aid cuts are desperate. I think everybody looks at them with, you know, a long silence after hearing about them. Maybe they will be short-lived. Maybe the economy will bounce back. Maybe they will presage some changes. And but I suppose part of the picture I was presenting was to be pragmatic. We can't make the world perfect. We can critique the things that are wrong, but we must work with what we have. What we have is a huge professional interest in gender equality and education amongst researchers, amongst policymakers, amongst practitioners, and amongst activists. And that's what we must work with. And if we can draw down aid to support it, great. If we have to use other ways of being heard and engaging with it, that'll also be what we'll do. But I'm not, I hope we won't, and this kind of activity won't be silenced. The question about indicators being gender biased is a really interesting question, because the whole process of collecting indicators, and there's a literature about how, you know, the indicator people don't go up to the top floors in tower blocks to collect data, or into the most rural areas, or into the worst areas of slums, so that the statistics are biased in some way, and we don't see the worst off, we don't see the worst elements of gender inequality aspects. And I think that's part of the rationale for this constant review and discussion. In the paper Sharon was talking about, which is under review for a journal, and we can share draft versions if people email us for it. There's the dynamic of constant discussion at every stage in relation to every one of the indicators, in every one of the domains in the AGEE framework. It's that process of discussion, review, drawing down multiple data sources that we hope we can hold those concerns with the bias of the indicators in play. I think that that's the best we can do to have this open participatory process. Thank you, Ismay. I don't know if I hand back to you and you maybe talk to some of the questions Sharon and Nicole and Yanchun might like to pick up.
Thank you, Elaine, for the response. I now invite
there's
Sharon
one more to me on patriarchal elements, but maybe Nicole and Yanchun and Sharon would like to pick up the question on gender bias in the indicators, and then I'll reply to the question on patriarchal attitudes.
Yeah, maybe concerning the question on indicators being, how to avoid them being gender biased. I think, as Elaine said, it's really also to start with the data collection itself, because it's really important to make sure that those we really want to reach in terms of policies and laws are also visible in tools to identify the problems, you know. And often data collection is biased in the sense that those who are really left behind and marginalized, including girls, but I think when we say girls, women, it's really important to look at and intersecting inequalities, gender inequalities, because this is also where, you know, for instance, girls living in remote areas, they may not necessarily be visible in data collection instruments and tools. So it's really important for policies to really be relevant in terms of targeting really those who are really need to be reached. It's really important that they are based on relevant tools where problems are really made more visible. So I think this will be my takeaway with this question. And concerning the question about gender norms and how to measure them, I think you know, gender norms have been measured and the surveys first by the World Value Surveys. So this is an important tools to collect information on values, beliefs, and attitudes that now we can use to analyze education data, because I really think that it's important to, when we are dealing with all these issues, to really trying to understand why is it that we still have barriers, why is it that it's so difficult to move beyond parities, to really get to the heart of the problems. So there are tools already out there. And also, if you take also the example of the European Europe barometers, it's also another instrument that collects data on values. And this is also where it's so important to go beyond the gender parity, because in number of most European countries, gender parity is achieved, or even we have more girls in school enrolled than boys, particularly at upper secondary education. But this is also the Euro barometer also showed us that there's a kind of backlash in terms of gender equality in a number of European countries, in particular those in eastern part of Europe, where there is a kind of regression in terms of gender equalities. So I think I said before that gender equality remains a distant goal. This is really true all over the world, that we are not yet there because of prevailing and still existing gender discriminatory norms that are really pervasive across countries. So I think it's important to bring this issue of gender norms and the fact that they are really shaping everything. And if they are not challenged, I think it will be really hard to advance gender equality.
Thank you very much, Liko. I think Liko said all. On social norms, as we are getting more and more data, like a World Value Survey, now we have 2005, 2009 survey, and also 2010, 2014. So we can compare the social norms over time. And we can also have the gender disaggregated analysis. Then in our research in the office, we use the simple index count. We also use the more complicated methodology to look at how social norms have been spread. So really, because of a time constraint, I cannot elaborate more, but I really encourage you to look at our report. It's a short report, but with also some country features. So you can see between men and women, between countries, there's a difference. Then that's something we should take into account when we come up to policy making. So I will stop here.
We are now just got 1 minute left to closing time. So I think at this moment, I would like to thank the presenters. All of you were brilliant, and we all enjoyed your presentation, which were very illuminative and informative. And I also want to thank the audience and for the questions that you have posed, and we will respond to the rest of the questions that you have put forward through email. Thank you very much, everyone.